Hello everyone, thanks for joining again. Good to have you all here. I'm sure we'll have more people trickling in throughout the meeting, but thanks to all those that are here just now. This is our 6th webinar in our self-build series, so good to see a decent number of people joining again. And as most of you will know, it's a series of webinars designed to help you get started on your self-build journey. So giving you all the tips and tricks that you need to know before you get started. As usual, the session will be recorded and uploaded excuse me, to YouTube afterwards, so you can catch up afterwards if you missed anything. As usual, just keep your mics and cameras off, and that's kind of all the housekeeping. But I'm Fraser, I'm the Associate Director at HebHomes, and I've been kindly joined by Alistair of the lending channel. So hello, Al.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Fraser.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for joining, Al. So Alistair's, he runs the lending channel up in Perth. He's been running the brokerage since '97, so he's got loads of experience, really experienced broker with all sorts of different types of finance for building your home. So we'll be speaking about various topics today, all to do with finance. Finance is one of the most important topics to look at, really, when you get started on your self-build journey. It's usually one big hurdle that a lot of people come across initially to get over. So we'll be talking through various topics such as self-build mortgages, bridging loans, alternative finance options, the deposit, so money you require for the build, finance required for the design phase, kit invoicing, build invoicing, and VAT as well. So Al, do you want to give us a bit of an introduction on the lending channel?
Thank you. Thanks, Fraser. And again, good afternoon to those of you that have just arrived. So as you can tell by my age demographic, I am no youth. I walked through the doors of the Clydesdale Bank as a school leaver in 1982, and I'm still working to this day. I established a lending channel in 2014. Actually, I've been a broker since '97, as Fraser mentioned, but we established this business in 2010. 2010. It's a family business, so it's my good lady wife Elaine, my brother Murray. The three of us are all the co-founders, and we've been building the team and building the business very nicely and steadily for the last 14 years. And we trade from our office in Perth, but we operate throughout the whole UK. So I'm not sure if the audience are mainly Scottish or UK wide, but we trade throughout the UK from our office here where I am today. And we're going to talk, as Fraser said, about primarily about self-build mortgage options, bridging loans. But as a broker, we do everything property related. So just to put that into context, we are FCA regulated, and we operate across all areas of property finance, from residential mortgages, commercial mortgages, holiday let, buy to let. But today we're talking about specifically the self-build mortgages that you're here to hear about, and other forms of finance that would help people access funding to build the home of their dreams, or indeed if they're looking to build something for investment purposes, i.e. a buy-to-let or a holiday-let, we can also offer solutions and advice on that as well.
Yeah, that's great, because we do have a lot of clients in both camps. You know, it's quite often it's a primary residence where they're looking to relocate to the countryside and build their own home. So self-build mortgages are very appropriate there, but also we do have people that are building as an investment property, and our houses do very well if you are letting them out. So if you did want to do a short-term rental or a long-term rental, they do very well. So good to see the various options, Al.
But the most common method for people, well, if you're not, I'll wind it back a bit, if you're not lucky enough to have a wealthy benefactor and don't have a stash of cash lying under your mattress, you're likely to have to access funding from somewhere. The most common and popular route is a traditional self-build mortgage, which really is just a mortgage, a traditional mortgage, with a little bit of extra hoops to jump through, because clearly you're building your own property, but the mortgage itself is assessed really in the very same way as a standard residential mortgage would be. So the lenders are looking to assess you on your income, so where your income has come, whether you're self-employed or employed, the level of deposit you've got and where that deposit's come from, Your age is also a factor into how long you can get the mortgage over, but you would just go through a normal mortgage underwriting journey in terms of the finance part of it. Obviously, there are some complexities in terms of the self-build, and we can talk more about the structure of the build and what information is needed for that side of it. But the actual mortgage finance part is really just the very same as if you were applying for a standard mortgage to buy an already built home as a first-time buyer or a next-again mover. So quite straightforward, really. Affordability, age, and also more and very importantly, credit profile. So these are the factors that the funder are looking at as a sort of starting point for you.
Great, thanks Al. So let's move on to the first slide. So it's very similar to what we're talking about. Do you want to take the lead on this, Al?
Yeah, so it's a broker like the lending channel. So identifying the right lender or the right process. So the whether you're going to be doing a self-build mortgage or using a bridging loan will form an early part of our teams, our advisors in the office. You've allocated your own dedicated advisor when you make your application, and their job as an advisor is to understand your needs, what you need and what your circumstances are. So they'll run through an initial very quick fact find with you to establish whether it's going to be a traditional self-build mortgage, whether it might be needed to go down a more complicated bridging finance route, and we'll talk about that separately. So we're going to focus on the self-build mortgages just now. So the first stage is for our advisors here to engage with you, the client. That's normally done by telephone. So again, we're UK wide, but most of our stuff these days is done by telephone or Teams or Zoom chat or a video chat if the client prefers. So we gather enough information to do an initial assessment on the finance aspect of it. Most lenders will lend up to 80% of what you're looking to borrow. So that's 80% of the end value of the property. And typically at any time during the build process, so clearly at the very beginning, you've got a chunk of land. Well, hopefully you've identified your land, because again, before we become involved as a broker, you usually have to have identified your land, and you'll have to have your land going through the planning permission to get your full detailed planning before a lender will lend. Now you can run these two things in conjunction. So if you're not sure that you'd qualify for a mortgage, you can actually get a decision in principle up front. So you can actually be approved for a level of finance based on the circumstances I explained. So income, deposits, credit, all those elements. So you could be approved and upfront for an amount of money that you may think you need to borrow. But for the application to start properly, you'll need to have identified and bought or be in the process of buying your plot of land, because clearly without the plot of land, this is only a dream. So we're trying to turn these dreams of yours into reality. So getting the plot of land, and it's always much easier if you can acquire the plot of land using your own cash. It's the easiest journey for a self-build mortgage. However, you can use the land and leverage some debt on that land. So if you're tight on cash flow, you can use the plot of land as leverage to borrow a bit of money at the beginning. But it is a much easier journey for the funder and for the onward stages of the process when you're releasing funds as the process continues, and we'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes as well. So identifying the land is a key starting point after you've maybe spoke to a broker to establish, can I get a mortgage? Would I qualify for a mortgage? So yes, you qualify, but next thing, you need to identify the plot of land, and the land will need to have full detailed planning before the lender will draw any funds down on that.
And just to add to that as well, if you don't qualify for self-build mortgage, there may be other options. So there's various government schemes that we'll run through very briefly, but there may be other options if you struggle to get that initial self-build mortgage.
Those come into play. There's a couple of government schemes, as Fraser has mentioned there, but you have to be evidence that you've been turned down for a mortgage. So that would normally be you've been turned down because it's affordability, so you can't afford the size of mortgage you want. You don't have sufficient deposit. Perhaps you're just at the wrong age range to qualify for a mortgage over a long enough period to fit the repayment. So if you've been declined for a mortgage, there will be a couple of other options that may be available to you.
But I think the decision in principle is probably a good place to start to check what could be available to you, because a lot of our clients are really early stages. They might be a few years off building and they're currently looking for land, and I guess it's building that budget and figuring out what the affordability is of the land, the actual build itself, and how that all comes together.
Absolutely. I mean, we can tell the client today, if we get an idea on what the end value of the property might be. So let's say the end value is going to be £300,000. Let's say the client's got £50,000 of their own cash to put in. So maybe that £50,000 will buy the plot of land. Well, in a lot of places it wouldn't buy the plot of land, but in some places it might, or it contributes to the plot of land. But somewhere in this equation there'll be an amount of money that the client will need to borrow. But understanding how much you need to borrow is also driven by what's it going to cost to build my house.
Yeah.
So if we get the client too early in the process, a lot of the figures are just a little bit of conjecture. We're just guessing. The client may need a mortgage of 200 grand, but it might be less, it might be more, depending on their project and what their build costs will be. But it's always very useful to at least run it past a lender, a broker, get a decision on principle, so to at least work out that you can afford X amount of mortgage. And you can then take that with some degree of confidence. You can then start identifying your plot of land, engage an architect, engage a project manager, start bringing the thing to life. Because and again, the audience on today, I guess, will be at various stages of this. As some of you will probably know already what it's going to cost you because you'll have engaged a project manager or a builder, you'll have an idea in your build costs, and others will be in the early stages, and maybe you don't have a clue how much it's going to cost you. And it has got tougher post-pandemic. It's definitely got tougher to build a house and still make really good money on the end value because of the rising cost of materials, which exacerbated during the kind of lockdown pandemic period. And although materials have come down a little bit since then, it's still a lot tougher these days to build a house for, let's say, £250,000 and it's worth 500 at the end. We've seen clients now that are building houses for 250,000 and they're maybe worth 275, for example. So it's become tougher. And you need to make sure the costs, while the funding is very important, but getting the costs right as well and not letting the costs run away. It's lovely to have granite worktops and all the expensive finishes when you get to that point. But if it's going to overrun your budget, and bear in mind when the lender approves your mortgage at the start, you won't be able to borrow any more money, or unlikely to borrow any more than that as the progress continues. So if you run out of money, which does happen sometimes, that can put the client in sometimes a precarious position. So keeping an eye on your costs is very, very important. So a good project manager is absolutely key to this.
Yeah, 100%. Okay. So Alistair's obviously, his brokerage has access to various different lending options. So you've got a panel of various different providers essentially for self-build mortgages, don't you? So you've got access to them.
Yeah. So that there are a number of lenders up and down the country. Scotland's a bit more restricted. There are more lenders lend in England than lend in Scotland, but there are enough lenders. So again, if the audience are primarily Scottish, I'm not sure you are, but let's assume that you are perhaps. There are enough lenders up in Scotland to give you sufficient lender choice. Market rates just now are more expensive. So self-build mortgages are more expensive from a pricing perspective than a standard residential mortgage. So put that into context, you'd probably be looking at your mortgage costs would be somewhere around low 6% just now. So yeah, your rate is probably going to start with a 6, high 5, maybe but a low 6. So 6% on a mortgage, and most of these mortgages, not all of them, but a lot of them are on variable rate mortgages. So, for example, last year when we were in a rising rate environment, a lot of my clients last year that were in the middle of the process saw their variable rate going up quite considerably last year, because every time bank base rate changed last year, then the mortgage rates on the self-build mortgage went up as well. And that put a bit of pressure on some clients in terms of if they were at the top of their budget on a 4% rate, by the time it gets to 6 or 7%, they may have gone past their budget in terms of monthly affordability. And to put into context as well about how much you pay per month for your mortgage. So a lender will give you an illustration at the very beginning when your mortgage is approved, and that will be for the whole amount of the mortgage that you've applied for. But each month your mortgage balance will likely change because you'll be drawing down monies each time the project continues. So you won't be taking your whole mortgage at the very beginning. So unlike a traditional mortgage, your mortgage payment will vary because the balance could vary from month to month as your project continues and it develops. As you keep borrowing more money to get to the next stage of that project, then you'll ask the bank to get more money. And for the bank to give you more money, you'll need to get your architect or your project manager to validate the work that's been done. And the bank will then send out their valuer to validate the work has been done properly and an uplift in value, hopefully. And you'll then release a little bit more cash at that point, and your mortgage payment for the next month would change. So the mortgage payments do vary as the project continues because obviously the mortgage balance is increasing. We're now in a rate environment, hopefully, I mean, nobody really knows, but all the experts are thinking that base rates, so base is sitting at 5.25 just now. There's an MPC meeting next month. There's obviously an election coming on the back of that. So the expectation is that if base rate doesn't come down in June, that by August that rates will start to come down a little bit. But none of the experts think that rates are going to go back to anywhere near where they were for the previous 10 years or so, when we were in a very low rate and almost an artificial rate environment. So if you're hoping that your self-led mortgage might be 2% next year, it's not going to happen. Might come down a bit from where it is now, so we're talking 6% roughly for your initial mortgage costs on a variable rate mortgage. That could easily be 5.5% by the end of this year, but it's probably not going to be much less. So we've got some clients just now still hedging, still thinking rates will come down to where they were, but I don't really think that's going to happen, in my honest opinion, and nor do the experts. Well, the supposed experts, shall I say.
Yeah, it's all guessing though, isn't it? They don't really know.
It is guesswork to some degree, it is.
I'd be surprised. I mean, my first mortgage that I got was 1.7%, and gone are the days. I don't think we'll ever see that again in our lifetimes. But well, you never know.
If there's people on this, if any audience or anyone near my age, then I remember mortgage rates being 15%. So, so I think rates where they are now is probably the average over a 30-year period. You know, rates at 4%, 5%, 6% is where mortgage rates normally are. They've just been artificially low, but then, as you said, Fraser, you get used to that. Yeah. And it's a lot better paying a mortgage at sub 2% than it is at 6%, clearly. So,
yeah. Well, that's great. I think it's something you can guess, but we don't really know. But I guess it would be good to talk through briefly. We should probably move off this slide. We've been on it a wee while now. But we should talk through just briefly the kind of difference between self-build and resident, like a standard residential mortgage, because I understand that you would get your self-build mortgage generally for your 2-year term, and then once that term is up, you'd then you could stay on it if you wanted, or you could move to a standard residential mortgage after that point.
Yeah, so absolutely. The common route, the most typical route, is once the self-build mortgage is completed and you've got your habitation certificate from the local authority, so your house is completed officially, you would move the mortgage onto a traditional residential mortgage. Now, as I said earlier, self-build mortgages are deemed as being slightly more risky, so they're priced a little bit higher than the overall market for mortgages. So while you're paying 6% plus for a self-build, you'd be hoping to get a mortgage at 4% plus in that sort of range. So you might lose a couple of percent off your mortgage by moving the mortgage to another provider. Now, some of the providers, for example, the Scottish Building Society, I've got a product where you can stay with them. You can move off their self-build mortgage pricing. And put that in context, the self-build mortgage with that particular lender is up over 8% just now. So there's quite a wide range of where the interest rates might be, but they're starting at low sixes. But you would typically move, without overcomplicating that too much, after your build's complete, you would move your mortgage either with the same funder if they have products available, or you'd move it, just a typical remortgage, to another funder at a traditional high street mortgage rate.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. Yeah. And in terms of, so we obviously have the two systems. We've got SIPs and the closed panel system. So SIPs, a lot of people do get mortgages on their SIPs houses. Generally, a lot of them go for, there's various different lenders, but Ecology Building Society is a good one. What was the one you just mentioned, Al?
Scottish Building Society.
Yeah, I know they cover SIPs as well, don't they?
They do cover SIPs, yeah. So there are quite a lot of lenders, actually. I did a bit of research on this, Fraser, since you and I spoke last week. So there are quite a number of mainstream mortgage lenders that are happy to lend on where there's been a SIP, such insulated panel that's been used for the build. So there's enough lender choice to give the client confidence they're not going to be stuck on a higher rate self-build mortgage for the life of the mortgage. There are enough. The newer closed panel, we're still waiting on some information coming back on that, but there are lenders that are lending on that currently. It's a more limited market than the standard SIPs, but there are lenders lending. I'm just waiting on some insight back from some of the surveying firms that we use to see if they think they're going to be acceptable to the wider mortgage market. But again, there are enough lenders currently lending to allow an exit for a self-build mortgage.
Yeah. Okay, and there's a question in just now about are there any additional exit fees if you're moving from self-build mortgage to traditional? It's something we spoke about previously, Al, you've got the term of the self-build mortgage generally will last 2 years.
Normally, So yeah, normally 2 years. So if you finish a house really quickly, let's say you've got so even on the variable rates, there's often early repayment charges if you leave funder within 2 years. Not with every funder, but it's quite typical. So if you finish a project early, let's say in 12 months, and you're all ready to move to a new funder, then you would likely be looking at an early repayment charge. It's normally in the 2 to 3% range of the mortgage balance, again, funder dependent. And the client would then need to decide, I'm going to hang fire on my variable rate just now. I'm going to wait another year, or if the new rate is compelling enough to pay the fee because the saving and the mortgage costs are going to make worthwhile moving, then the client might move. Again, it's our job as an independent broker at the various parts of that journey to advise the client appropriately and say, well, actually, you better just hang on fire just now. You've only got 6 months or 9 months left. Don't pay the penalty. Or no, your interest rate is so much cheaper. So let's get you moved now. But you're going to have a little bit of pain because you've got a fee to pay. But overall, it might be more cost effective.
And can you choose, you get both options between fixed and variable still with a self-build mortgage?
There are less options at fixed.
Right.
So there's
Okay,
many more options at variable. So it's typically a variable rate, but not exclusively, but there are many more options at variable rate.
Okay, no, that's good to know. Right, let's move on from this slide. Okay, bridging loans. So this is alternative finance to self-build if you're looking at a buy-to-let or a holiday let, you'll need to look at alternative finance. So again, this is your bread and butter. So do you want to take the lead?
So a bridging loan would come into play if the client, so as I said earlier, self-build is the easiest, it's the cheapest and the most traditional route to building the home of your dreams and using a self-build mortgage. If it doesn't work out, for example, because you've not fitted the lending criteria, so it could be on credit profile, it could be on age, affordability, whatever of those factors make you not qualify for traditional self-build, a bridging loan may be an option. It's slightly riskier, it's more expensive, but they are relatively common routes for people to build properties. They're also very common routes for people that have ran out of money and they're halfway through a project, which is actually more common than you might think. So to put it in context, the pricing for a bridging loan is probably going to be double figures. So again, when we're talking 6% typically, up to maybe 8% for a self-build mortgage, you could be looking at 12 to 15% for a bridging loan. So significantly more expensive. But again, put that in context. You're only paying interest on what you've drawn down, and you're only paying interest for the period you've got the loan outstanding. So like a self-build mortgage, a bridging loan requires an exit. So there's two common routes to exit. One would be a refinance, and the second would be a sale. So again, some people are not just building the homes of their dreams; they're building homes to make money from the profit and move them on, and then do a future project. So if you're selling, nice and easy, you sell the property, you exit the short-term finance, the bridging loan. If you're refinancing, which is probably more common, bear in mind if you've had issues getting a self-build mortgage, you may have issues getting a remortgage to exit the bridge. So we need to tread very carefully at the beginning when we are onboarding the client at the beginning. If they've not fitted for the self-build mortgage route, we need to understand the reasons why, because we need to be able to find an acceptable exit route for that mortgage if they're not selling the property, or if they've not got cash coming. So some people have got cash coming from other inheritances, etc., and they're using the short-term vehicle. But a bridge does have a finite term, normally 18 months. So after 18 months, the client will have to exit that bridge through a refinance or a sale. So we need to make absolute certain at the very beginning of the process that we can lead the client through the route to that solution.
Yeah, I think it's really important to know that, and the fact that your broker is there to help you through that process and think of the long term rather than just the short term finances, making sure that you're protected and your risks are as low as possible going through that process.
It's probably a more common route to finance for investors, so people that are building properties for letting, either short-term lets, holiday lets, Airbnb type scenario, which obviously now requires a license. So again, I don't know if any of you in the audience are in that market, but you know that the Scottish Government have brought in licensing and all the different local authority, and again there's varying rules, depends which area you actually live in, but you need to get a license, and in some areas you need to get planning permission. So we've seen people now buying those properties, not self-builds, I'm digressing slightly, but they're buying properties using a bridging loan to acquire a property, get it through planning and get it licensed, and then they move it on to a holiday let mortgage. But the same thing can apply for if you've got a plot of ground and you want to build holiday lodges or properties for letting. Bridging finance is much more common than a self-build mortgage, because most self-build mortgages are designed for the client's main residence only.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really important to consider this, because quite a lot of our clients will be building holiday lets or buy to lets, and it's understanding how that process differs. So of course you couldn't get a self-build mortgage for doing a buy to let, essentially.
Not normally, no, not normally. So bridging finance is much more common for that.
Yeah. And I guess you want to try and get out of that. You want to pay off that loan and get a buy-to-let loan mortgage.
Buy-to-let. So just either a traditional buy-to-let. So if it's for long-term lets, a traditional buy-to-let mortgage, or if it's for holiday lets, then it's a slight variance on buy-to-let. There are proper holiday let mortgages available in the market just now. So you would use one of those finance routes, holiday let mortgage or buy-to-let, to exit the short-term bridging loan.
Yeah, and generally, would you change from the bridging loan to your holiday let mortgage once you've reached practical completion and the building is practically complete?
As quickly as the client can, because again, the bridging finance is the more expensive model there. So the client wants to exit the bridge. So they may have taken the bridge over 12 months, for example, but they may complete the project in 6 months. So bridging finance works almost like a bank overdraft. You're usually only charged interest until the day of settlement. So even though you've taken the facility over a longer period, you'd normally only pay for what you've used. That's the main difference. So the client wants to exit the bridge really as quickly as they can. So getting the property completed and getting the habitation. So once it's done, it's getting the council's confirmation that it's been built properly, subject to all the warrants. And once they've got that habitation certificate, then you'll be able to take a valuation for mortgage purposes and lending after that.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. Okay, so you need your building
Makes
control completion certificate.
Yes.
Get everything tied up with that, and then you can essentially move into the house at that point. Usually there's the snagging period that lasts for 12 months after you move in, but that's really just to catch any little minor snags, and that won't. The
snagging won't affect the lending. The lender will do their bank valuation once it's completed, but they will need evidence that they've got building controller signed it off.
Yeah. Okay, that's all very clear. Thanks, Al. And alternative financing options, it's what we discussed earlier, and some of it's very obvious. Obviously, if you have the cash, as Al said, stashed underneath your mattress,
cash is
to use that.
Cash is always king, clearly, in any scenario, if you have the cash, because what you have, the only slight unfortunate thing of using the bank's money is the bank are all over you. So every stage of the build, so your various stages, as you're drawing the funds down at the various stages, because the bank are releasing the money, the bank are in control of the purse strings, which can sometimes be a little bit painful, because you've done the next stage of the build, your architect or project manager signed it off, and you want your money, but the bank need to send out their surveyor. They need to validate that it's been done properly. I mean, it's all relatively straightforward, but it's definitely much easier doing cash, because then the client's in the driving seat then. But everyone doesn't have the cash. Otherwise, I'd be out of a job. So
exactly. Yeah, I mean that's the thing. It's talking to the banks and making sure things line up, and we will talk about that a wee bit in more detail in one of the following slides. But if you've got cash, then that makes things a lot easier.
Sorry, Fraser. What's almost as common is the second point on the slide that you can see. There is leverage debt and other properties. So, I mean, a lot of people will just have their main residence, and they'll maybe be selling that to lift out the equity to maybe buy the land and end up in rented accommodation or in a caravan, but they'll need to use the money. But other people are lucky enough; they've got other properties, so they can leverage cash if they've got properties with the equity, buy to lets in the background, holiday lets, and you can release cash that way, which is quite common as well for people that are more common for those building portfolios, again, holiday let portfolios, buy to let portfolios, less common maybe for traditional self-build where they've only got one property.
And generally when you remortgage, you'll need to tell your current lender that you're planning on doing a build. So it's making,
I mean, the lender needs to know what you're doing and needs to understand what the use of funds are. But I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate purpose. I'm building another property, so they want some validation that the funds have been used for. But it's a perfectly valid use. So that would be no problem.
Yeah, and there's the list of government schemes. There may be additional ones, but generally there's council government-backed funds that make funds available to people that can't qualify for self-builds. So
yeah, absolutely. And there's plenty of information. You just do a Google search on any of those schemes, whichever part of the country you're actually in. And there's quite a lot of information. It's not something we do, but we sometimes signpost people. If we're not able to help them, we'll signpost them to one of these resources. And after that, we're not really involved in the process because it's just not our involvement at that stage.
Yeah. And deposit, we did get a question about the deposit previously. So just the amount of money available, and I think it'd be good if you could go into a bit more detail, Al, about the purchasing the land and why it's beneficial to be able to, even though you can get around it, it's beneficial to have the land in your ownership before you get the mortgage in place.
So most lenders, again, you think back to traditional mortgage lending, there are a couple of lenders doing 100% mortgages for first-time buyers. There are more doing 95% mortgages. Self-build's a bit more risky, so the funders normally restrict that to 80%. That's an 80% mortgage overall when the project is completed. But during the build process, so the various stages of your build, the lender won't allow you to have any more than 80% of the current value of the property. So again, the value will change each time you do some work on the property. Hopefully, we're not lifting value. So at any point, the lender will not allow you to borrow any more than 80% of that valuation. With land, it's a little bit different. Most of them will cap it at 60% of the land value. So if your land is worth, keep it simple, £100,000, and you need to buy that plot and use some of the bank's money, you wouldn't get any more than £60,000 lending on that bit of land. So you have to have £40,000 of your own cash resource to go into that. Where that can be slightly challenging is when you're then coming on to your next stage of the build. So the first proper stage of the build, which might be foundations in, concrete poured, for example, and then there's often a huge amount of uplift in value at that first stage of the build. So when the banks send their valuer out, and maybe you need £25,000 or £30,000 for your next stage after, which could be paying for your kit, for example, paying for your panels, your kit, whatever, and it may be that it doesn't value at a high enough value to give. So let's say if I was £110,000 for argument's sake, you're not going to get enough at 80% out of that to maybe pay for your kit. So you need to be very careful when you're doing your cash planning at the beginning, that you know what you've got in reserve and cash reserve. And if you are dependent on the plot of land to leverage most of your debt, I would say it's going to be a tougher journey going forward to get enough money out to get to the point where you're adding significant value. And the big value comes when you've got your kit up, wind and watertight, and that's when the big sort of jump in value comes. At the early stages, there's not often enough to get you enough out to do your next stage. So for example, if you own your land for £100,000 and the bank will lend you up to say 60% of that value, you can get £60,000 at day one to do your next stage, because you've not had to use some of that debt to acquire the land in the first place. Have I explained that clearly enough?
Yeah, because we've got the note here saying 80% funding on land and self-build on the actual build itself. So at the end of the project, once you've got the house built, you've got the land, obviously, and are you able to get 80% funding on the total value of that, or is it 80% of the house?
It's 80% of the total end value. So the total end value of the house on that plot. So there's one value of that. So the end value, and that will be no more than what you've been approved for at the beginning. So again, the bank will have looked in real detail at the beginning. The bank want to see the build costs, the broken down build cost, the cash flow. The bank need to understand that the client understands when they'll need the various chunks of money to do the various stages. It's very important that the project manager and the client work closely with their cash flow at the beginning, because what sometimes happens is that they get approved for a mortgage and the costs are not quite right, so the materials change, and then when it becomes maybe 4/5 of the way through, they come to get their last draw, but they've already borrowed as much as they've been approved for. So it's not the 80% figure that might be an issue at that point. It's, well, the client can't get any more mortgage borrowing because they've maxed out at a figure that's lower. So the 80% is always the maximum, provided the client has been approved for a mortgage up to that maximum based on affordability and other factors I mentioned earlier. So It's really important the groundwork's done at the early stages of let's get this cash flow done. What's the project going to cost me? And when will I need the money? And the project manager will help with that. So you'll need money to do the various stages. As I said, the concrete in, the founds getting done, the kit. When do I need to pay for the kit? Will the kit provider allow me to do it on a deposit? Can it? So again, all these, when do you need to have the cash is really important. And that's why people sometimes run out of money because they've not done their homework properly.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Al. So just going into a little bit more about the finance required for the initial early stages. So as I was talking about, If you can get the land, if you can buy it cash, then that's great. It makes the process easier, and it helps the money flow a bit easier through the build phase. But the design phase, it's usually a phase that takes a good chunk of time. It can take longer than the actual build itself. But that's something either we would be managing for you if you were in Scotland and you wanted to use our planning and building control service, or if you've got your local architect, they're dealing with your project and getting the site surveyed and deal with planning and building control. That does take a good amount of time, but relatively the design phase is really cheap compared to the build. So you don't need as much available funds. So generally our clients do quite well if they can just fund the initial design phase themselves, and then seek get the mortgage, the first kind of payments for the mortgage as you start with the groundworks. Your professional fees generally between 25 and 30,000 pounds all in, once you've accounted for all the consultant work and the site visits. The kit invoices, I'll go through it in a bit more detail about how the kit is paid down, because we invoice it in chunks as you go through that process. Because we have various consultants, engineers, energy assessors and things that contribute towards the final detailed design. So all these kind of figures tally up to give you your total, and it depends on the size of the kit. So our smallest kits will be X amount and the larger will be more, obviously. So this will help you start building a picture of the available funds that would be helpful to have before you go through that journey. Obviously, purchase of land, your professional fees for purchasing and going through that process, also land tax as well. So there's various taxes in different countries in the UK.
Sorry, Fraser, to jump in you there. Just on the land tax part, if clients they still own their current main residence, so if they've not sold it yet and they're buying, depends what level they're buying it, they may need to pay the additional dwelling supplement during the process, but they'll get that back when they sell their main residence. So once they replace their main residence, so they may need to pay it at the beginning.
And do you need to do that within a year, or is there not a time cap on that?
It's a year and a half just now, I think. So a year and a half. It's going to be changed, but a year and a half currently to sell the current main property to get that back.
Yeah. So this kind of the tax and the additional dwelling supplement, you should seek professional advice. So a solicitor solicitors are usually well placed on advising on how much is payable and how much is recuperable if you were going to sell. So just to be aware of that. But you can get really quite far through the process with a fairly low amount of money compared to the build cost. If you couple up the professional fees and the kit invoices, you're maybe looking at about 50 or 60,000 pounds. And then when you're essentially in the position to get started, and you're looking at getting a contractor on site, and you're looking at doing the groundworks, and you come back to us and you say we're good to go, we'll book in the kit erection, we'll book in the window supply, and then that's when the remaining kit invoices are due, and we'll go through how that's broken down in one of the next slides. This slide, perfect. So I'll just run you through very briefly how we invoice for the kit, so you can start to build a picture of what funds, how the funds are broken down through the process. So at the very start, we just take a £950 deposit on the kit, and that's enough to give you the drawings with any amendments that you want to make to them to go in for your planning application. So that's all your floor plans and elevations. Then once you've got your planning approved, that's when we take 10% of the kit upon issue of the detailed drawings. So that's all the wall build-ups and the electrical layouts. It's basically our drawings in much greater detail. And then after that, we'll send it off to the consultants and get the engineering completed, finalise the package, and then that's where the next 10% is due just prior to the building control application. So that's what we just looked at in the previous slides. That's your 20% of the kit to get you to the building control application phase. And then once you've got your building warrant approved, that's when we push the button on the kit. You come to us and say, let's go ahead. We'll talk about dates and get something booked in. Then we'll take 20% of the kit price so we can order the windows. Then 40% just prior to going through manufacture. Manufacture usually happens probably about 6 weeks before it's due on site. Maybe a little bit less time, but we like to allow a good amount of time to get it into the factory. And then once it's delivered to site, that's when 17.5% is due, and then 2.5% once the kit's wind and weather tight. So really whistle-stop tour of invoicing. There's more information on this if you want to revisit it on the website under our guidance section under payment schedule. And then the build invoicing. So this is quite a big topic, I guess, but it would be good to get a bit of your input, Alan, on the how the funds are broken down and when it's requested. But generally, this is the thing that it's all about communication, and it's telling the banks when the funds are needed, and if there's any changes, it's updating them on changes. We did discuss previously about increasing costs, so it's trying to make sure that you've got a really good handle on the costs, and your contract administrator can really help you do that, and make sure that there's as few unknowns at the start of the project. So with building contracts, you will have a building contract in place with your contractor. So once you've selected your contractor, and it'll have a duration for the contract, so there'll be a target completion date, and it'll also have the build sum as well. Within that build sum, there may be what's called provisional sums, which are the kind of unknowns, and they will put in an indicative figure. So things like the biggest unknowns are usually to do with something like groundworks, where you don't really know exactly what you're getting into until you've actually dug the trenches for your foundations. So there may be some variance, but usually there will be a contingency built in somewhere so that there's some funds there to cover any of these kind of unknowns. And also variations as well. So if you went onto site and you decided you wanted to change something or change the spec of something and the prices go up, that's where you need to be aware that the banks may not be able to lend any additional if you're funded up to 80%. But Al, do you want to go through the kind of general schedule of what happens with the communication with banks?
The typical schedule would be, so the first stage is acquiring the land, and you may or may not require funding for that, as we discussed earlier. The next stage is the foundations go in. Third stage is normally building up to eaves level. And then the fourth stage is normally kits on, wind and watertight, roofs done, roof tiled. And then after that, you've got your internals, you've got your plaster works, electrics, joinery, plumbing, etc., etc. So they're the sort of four key stages. And what happens at the end of each key stage is that you would have, perhaps depends where your budget's go, you've maybe ran out of money after you've done the sort of first or the next stage. So you get your project manager to sort of sign off the work that's been done, architect, project manager. The bank then sends out their valuer to validate the work's been done properly, and they'll put a value on the improved land at that point. And they do that every time you want to borrow more money. So the stages I gave you there are the typical stages, but you may have more stages than that depending on how your project's going. But they're the typical stages that most self-builders will be wanting to take their money at those stages. But that can vary, and the funders will give you at the beginning of the process, or the broker will give you a proper list of work. So it's like a blank template with all the various stages that you'd have, down to the minute detail of what each part's going to cost. And again, your project manager or contractor will help you with it. Fill that in. And that's broken down into the various stages I've just described. So you can normally see it at a glance once that's been done. I'm going to need X amount at stage 1, Y amount at stage 2. Now, it doesn't always go to plan because things take longer sometimes, material costs sometimes change, but that should give you a fairly good working schedule of what you'll need and when you'll need it, providing things go to plan, of course.
Yeah, generally when they go through the process, you'll have the plan, the kind of payment schedule in front of you that the contractor's prepared and the contract administrator's checked and the banks have checked. Generally, the contractor will do the works in arrears, charge for the work in arrears, but they'll do usually about 4 weeks. Usually it is 4 weeks of work. It really does depend on the contract. And then at the end of that term, they will apply for payment. So they'll issue the invoice essentially. Your contract administrator will go out and check the works and issue an interim payment certificate to say you need to pay the contractor X amount based on the works completed. Al, you mentioned that the banks sometimes want to go out and visit as well.
The bank will. So at each stage, they'll send out their valuer because, again, for lending purposes, it's the bank's valuer that will validate the value of the property at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Okay.
just like in any traditional mortgage, when the bank are lending, they'll want a valuation done on the property. A self-build is no different. At the various stages, if the client wants more money, the bank's own valuer will need. So again, that's going out at the client's expense. So each stage that happens, though. So again, the less times you can send the valuer out is better, depending on how good your cash flow is going. But when the bank sends out their valuer, he or she will validate the value of the property, and the client will then get up to 80% of that improved value, less whatever they've currently got outstanding.
Yeah, okay. That's good to know. And I presume, would they take into account the contract that's in place with the contractor?
They'll want to see the contract. So if it's a fixed price contract, which is common, but it's not the only way these days, because a lot of contractors have stopped giving fixed price contracts. But yeah, the bank will want to understand at the very beginning as part of the mortgage approval process is, one, the client gets approved for the amount of money they want to borrow, and second, they're almost approving the contractor. So the bank will want to understand who the contractor is, what their experience is. They'll want to see the contract. So they want to understand that the contractor can deliver for the client. And that's just to protect the bank as much as the client. Because if they're using their own contractor with limited experience, the banks may be less willing to actually lend. Hopefully the contractor is experienced and can demonstrate that experience, because that's all part of the early process of the bank underwriting the build. So the client is one part of the process, and the second part is, well, who's the PM, who's the project manager, who's the contractor, who's the architect. That's all very important, again, to protect both the bank and the client.
Yeah. And usually contracts will have some kind of retention sum. So the ones that we usually see have about 5% retention, and that basically means that you withhold 5% of every valuation until the end of the project.
That's quite typical, yeah.
Do the banks take that into consideration when
They'll
they're
take that into consideration as well when they're doing? Yeah, they will.
Yeah, and that's basically that's a sum to leave a little bit in the bank to encourage the contractor to come back and complete it basically right at the end of the project. So it's good to have a little bit left over. Means that your risks are kept as low as possible. Generally, once you reach practical completion, which is when the building control officer will issue your completion certificate and you can move into the house, and you enter into the snagging period where there's nothing major to be done. There's maybe just like little nicks of paint here and there, or very minor cosmetic things to do. You usually enter into a 12-month snagging period or rectification period. So when you move in, that's when you pay back usually half of the retention, so reducing the retention sum to 2.5%, which is released once all the snagging is completed, usually a year later. It all does vary depending on the contract and depending on negotiations with the contractor, but they're very typical.
Yeah. Plus, the bank will also expect to see a contingency in place as well, maybe 10% of the total build cost. They want to make sure that contingency is there and available. And that's to protect everybody against cost overruns.
Yeah. Okay.
Makes sense. I see there's another question. I don't know if you've seen that question coming in, Fraser, a while ago from Jordan.
Yes. So about a rented flat where you paid additional tax on, you're selling your main residence to build, and where you pay additional tax on the flat. So these kind of questions, we're not tax advisors, and it's a very specialist subject.
I can probably answer that to some degree. So you wouldn't pay the additional tax again on the flat. You've already paid it once. I don't know if you're planning to move into the flat. I don't know what your plan is when you sell your main residence to build where you're going to be living. You could almost move into your buy-to-let property, and then essentially you would be able to get that money back that you've paid, the 6% EDS you paid in the flat in the first place. Depending on when you bought it, you may have had it for ages. He's now said planning to live with family. Yeah, so I was just thinking the EDS, the 6%, is a replacement of main residence. So in this case, Jordan's confirmed that he's not doing that. In this case, planning to live with family. So you wouldn't pay it again on the flat, but you may pay it on the land depending on the land value.
Yeah, it's good, as we mentioned, just seek specialist advice on these kind of tax subjects or ADS, just to make sure you have complete clarity, and usually a solicitor or a tax advisor will be able to give you those answers.
We've got a working knowledge of it, but it's clearly in our disclaimers we're not tax advisors. So and it can get quite complex. Some of the stuff saying I've seen us asking 3 different lawyers and get 3 different answers. So get everything in writing. So
yeah, 100%. And Again, caveated VAT, we're not VAT specialists, but we do work with it quite regularly. So we do have a bit of an understanding. But for your project, usually, it's good to get a bit of that specialist advice, particularly if you're working with existing buildings as well, because there's a lot of caveats and lots of different ways to go about paying VAT and being lean where you can and not paying as little as you can, essentially. But one of the general benefits of going with self-build is they're VAT exempt for the build itself in the UK. So I know in Ireland, I think you pay 13.5% on all builds in Ireland. But the main difference in the UK is that you pay 20% on renovation and extension. So it immediately puts up the price of any build that you do with an existing building by 20%. But then this is why you should seek specialist VAT advice, because there's some ways that you can get around, or you can get reduced rates of VAT if the building's been uninhabited, or there's probably other various other things that you can do to reduce that. But yeah, self-builds are VAT exempt in the UK, and you will pay VAT on the professional services fees, so your architect, your submissions, your surveys, all that kind of stuff, you'll pay VAT on that, and randomly the kitchen appliances. But apart from that, it's all VAT exempt.
Sorry, I was going to jump in. Make sure that your paperwork is good, that you've got all your invoices, that you've got, so when your accountant comes to file the claim for the VAT, that you can lay your hands on everything, because you need to be organised with your paperwork.
Definitely, yeah. And for the actual kit itself, for supply and erect jobs, we don't charge VAT, so they're all ex-VAT invoices. If we're doing a supply only job, we need to charge VAT on that, and then you claim it back at the end of the process when you do your DIY VAT claim. It seems a crazy way to do it, but it's just where the money moves, and is how it works, unfortunately. But you'll need access to additional funds to then claim that back once you complete. Is there anything else in this? I think I've covered all of this. Yeah, I think the main thing is seek the advice if you need it, but generally self-builds are VAT exempt. And that brings us to the end. I don't think we've got any. If you do have any other questions, just drop them in the chat, but I think we've covered everything. Al, is there anything that you think we should add that we've not covered, or have we covered all bases?
Hopefully we've not overcomplicated the process from the finance perspective. Hopefully that's made sense and brought it to life a little bit. So no, I think hopefully that's been a good session.
Yeah, that's been really helpful, I think, because it's a complicated topic, and we have covered a lot of subjects. So hopefully it's helped start to build a bit of a picture about finance and the various avenues you can take. But I think the biggest thing is just making sure you're working with the right people. So working with the right broker is really important, because they can help you through that process and think of the long term and make sure that you've got everything in place for the funding of the project. Obviously at HebHomes we can supply all the drawings and the kit itself. We can help you with the design phase and the planning and building control through up in Scotland, or you can work with your local architects. And we've got affiliated architects all across the UK. We've got full coverage of the UK and Ireland. So if you do need help finding an architect, you can find their details on our website through services and planning and building control service. So you can see if you can contact them if you need any additional help with the early stages of your project. If you want to come and talk to us, feel free. You can get in touch with my colleague Lindsay. And if you're looking to build a Heb home, you've got a plot identified and you've got the budget kind of sorted out, then we'd be happy to have a chat and see where we can help. And for funding inquiries, you can get in touch with Alistair at al@thelendingchannel.co.uk. But thank you very much for joining us, Al. It's been a pleasure having you, and it's been very
You're welcome.
So much appreciated.
I'm just answering a question quickly that Cassie has asked about funders. Cassie, sometimes lenders are just lazy and don't take the time to understand modern construction methods. It's normally down to the surveyor. If the surveyor says it's suitable for conventional mortgage lending, that ticks boxes for most lenders, but it's lazy lending. There's big volume lenders want to pile them high, simple, straightforward transactions, and don't also have the time to invest in stuff that's slightly non-standard. But SIPs are becoming more popular, and more lenders are lending.
Yeah, that's really useful. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Al.
You're welcome, Fraser. Good to see you.
Thank you very much for joining, and yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully see you at the next one. So the next webinar is about the heritage of HebHomes, and I'll be joined by Alistair Stephen, obviously the Managing Director of HebHomes, and also Neil Stephen, the Managing Director of Dilkus Architects. So they'll be talking us through where both companies came from and a little bit about the heritage. So hopefully we'll see a lot of you there, but enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.
Great, thanks Fraser, thanks guys.
Thanks everyone, cheers.